Well, China the friend, China the enemy, a key ally or a rival to be feared. With the rhetoric coming out of Washington, it's often hard to tell the difference. But friend or foe, the countries are intertwined economically. And in these difficult economic times, it's hard to ignore the extent of China's economic success. Many Western economies are floundering, prompting some to even declare a crisis in Western liberal capitalism. Meanwhile, in the emerging markets of Asia, Brazil, South Africa, and elsewhere, they are sailing right along on the powerful wave of state capitalism. Now, whether guided by the invisible hand of the market or a carefully planned state strategy, capitalism does seem to be evolving. And countries like China, well, they seem to be doing something right. And it's certainly worth asking whether there are some lessons for the U.S. along the way. Well, for that, I'm joined by Ann Lee. She's a professor of economics at the New York University, and she's the author of this book here, What the U.S. Can Learn from China. Hi, Ann. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, I want to begin by looking at sort of a lot of the rhetoric that we get, especially out of the GOP candidates running for office. We often see this tendency to blame China on, loss in manufacturing, on our economic woes. How valid are those critiques?
I think that the critiques, the rhetoric levied against them is mostly really unfounded, because when we accuse them of being unfair with trade and accuse them of state capitalism that's not similar to ours, the evidence is quite to the contrary. The U.S. actually engages in state capitalism too. We have DARPA, which is basically an arm of the Department of Defense that invests in all kinds of companies that can develop new weaponry for our Defense Department. We obviously support all our large multinational banks because they're all too big to fail. And so the only difference here is that we will socialize the costs and allow private gains, whereas in China, even though they also explicitly back the banks there, they don't give out gigantic billion-dollar bonuses to their bank executives. And so I would say that it's really unfair. It's not really state capitalism versus liberal capitalism. It's really more of who has more crony capitalism, and that's really at issue.
And that's an excellent point, one I think that's sort of slowly starting to filter into our society with movements like the Occupy Wall Street movement, but hasn't really sort of filtered into the mainstream. And one point that you've written about in a world without China is how China's growth has actually helped ease the economic crisis here in the U.S. I don't think that that's something that most Americans are used to hearing. So if you can just explain that briefly.
Absolutely. Well, what a lot of Americans don't understand is that without China, major segments of our economy wouldn't be employed. We always focus on manufacturing here by the politicians, but because of China, we have grown a lot of jobs in the service sector, such as in the legal field, in finance, in marketing and sales. So these jobs are not being accounted for, and in fact, those are higher paying jobs, and it really benefits the economy that way. And I explained in that article that the Federal Reserve here has done many studies that show that because of our trade with China, we actually make more money here than if we didn't have China in the picture.
Now, switching gears just a little bit to the way that sort of elections are run, I want to bring up another point that you've written about, sort of looking at how the U.S. could learn a thing or two from China in terms of how politicians are picked. Because, of course, here we often hear China's political model criticized, for quite loudly so. But a lot of times we have people who are elected into office who don't necessarily look out for the greater good of the country. So talk a little bit about the difference or what exactly it is that the U.S. Could learn from China's playbook when it comes to running for office.
Absolutely. A lot of Americans have this misconception that China is just a dictatorship. It's untrue because a lot of these jobs are not earned through patronage. What they are positions that politicians earn. So if I can make an example, an analogy, is that China is more like a corporation. The people that run the country earn their way to the top through decades of government service. Similarly, we don't elect a CEO. A CEO has to demonstrate over his career that he has experience and the knowledge to lead an organization. And so it's the same with China. The leaders basically have to first pass the competency test, which tends to be very difficult. Fewer than 20% of the people that take it actually pass. And then once they're in the central government system, they're rotated to different positions throughout the government for 5-year terms, and they can't serve a term for more than 2 years. And so this system of moving them around so that they don't develop corrupt relationships with just that particular region or organization, that they must be developing ways to improve the institution while they're there because they have various evaluations by people who work with them, and this is all handled and evaluated by the largest human resources department in the world. They basically promote the people that do well, demote the people that don't do well. And so by the time that someone's considered for the top position in the country, they have already helped serve hundreds of millions of people in China in a beneficial way.
Well, that's certainly something. Go ahead.
Oh, and so what I suggest that there are elements of this system that might work in a democratic capitalist society. The idea of maybe reintroducing civil service exams, because we only have that in the foreign service in the U.S. today. The idea that people actually have to prove some competency before they are appointed positions.
Well, and unfortunately, we're out of time. But the idea that people have to prove competency in what they're actually talking about before serving in office is certainly a brilliant one. And I definitely think that it's something to consider to sort of move politicians around so they don't have time to establish those corrupt relationships with lobbying firms and various influences. So unfortunately, we have to leave it there for now. But hopefully, we'll have you back on the show. That was Ann Lee, the economics professor at New York University, and the author of the book, What the U.S. Can Learn from China.